June 4, 1942. Dawn set the Pacific aglow, its surface deceptively still. On the distant horizon, the Japanese carrier Akagi cleaved the sea. The decks a bustle of activity pilots, tuning engines, sailors wheeling bombs into place, officers barking orders for the next sortie. It stood as the pride of Japan's fleet, the flagship that had led the strike on Pearl Harbor. Yet, only 6 months later, the hunter was on the verge of becoming the hunted. Then shadows fell. From the squashy American dive bombers tucked their wings and plunged into a deadly descent. Their engines screamed as anti-aircraft batteries thundered in reply. Black clouds of flak speckled the sky. Still, the attackers pressed on. At exactly 10:26 a.m., a single 1,000-pound bomb tore through Akagi's flight deck and slammed into the hangar, igniting fuel lines and torpedoes stowed beneath. In seconds, the carrier was a blazing furnace. Steel groaned and twisted. Flames shot upward, and men fled through choking smoke. The ship that had symbolized Japan's naval supremacy was doomed within minutes. Could so formidable a warship, once untouchable, collapse so swiftly? What fatal sequence of choices had led to this instant? On Akagi's bridge stood Captain Tairo Aayoki, a veteran officer whose calm eyes hid the storm within. At 51, Aayoki was no stranger to combat. He had commanded the Akagi since before Pearl Harbor's early triumph and now carried the heavy responsibility of defending Japan's empire. The morning of June 4th stretched every nerve taut. Reports poured in. American carriers had been sighted and enemy squadrons were inbound. Aoki's crew worked frantically, arming aircraft for a counterstrike. The hangars below were crowded with planes being rearmed. Fuel tanks topped up, bombs and torpedoes scattered across the deck. Amid the chaos, a young sailor, barely 20, paused to catch his breath. He wiped sweat from his brow. The metallic sting of aviation fuel burned his nose. He glanced skyward. The firmament seemed endless. Yet a knot of dread tightened in his gut as if danger waited just beyond the horizon. For Aayoki, each decision bore weight. Should he launch at once or hold back to strike with overwhelming force? At 10:20 a.m., the first wave struck low torpedo squadron 8 from USS Hornet 15, lumbering devastators skimming the sea. SLOW, and poorly protected, Japanese Zeros dove on them without mercy, shredding formation after formation. One after another, the American torpedo planes erupted in flames or cartwheeled into the water. Only a single pilot from Hornet Squadron lived to tell the tale. Their loss, however, was not pointless. By drawing the Zeros down to wave-top level, they pulled fighter cover away from the carriers. Far above, from around 15,000 feet, McCluskey's SPD Dauntless dive bombers folded their wings and fell toward their targets. Lieutenant Richard Best fixed his eyes on Akagi. Below him, the flight deck was a messercraft being armed, munitions scattered, and fuel shining in slick patches. He steadied himself, let go of the bomb, and the blast detonated aviation gasoline. Fire raced into the lower decks and set off torpedoes stored in hasty stacks. In seconds, secondary detonations ran through the ship. Thick black smoke coiled up and dimmed the midday sun as burning wreckage was hurled about. Sailors were ripped from their stations and men howled as flames swallowed compartments. On the bridge, Aayoki staggered as the carrier shuddered. He barked orders to fight the blaze, but the inferno outran the hoses. The vessel's core had been struck, and Akagi's doom was sealed within minutes. From a historian's perspective, Midway turned less on raw numbers than on a knife-edge mix of choices and chance. For Japan, the critical mistake was timing. Admiral Nagumo had left his carriers Kagi Kagasoryu and Haryuin a precarious state, caught between rearming for Midway strikes and preparing to counter American carriers. In that confusion, the decks filled with bombs, fuel, and semi-prepared planes, a catastrophe waiting for a spark. On the American side, bravery met luck. The torpedo squadrons wiped out at sea level had, without knowing it, cleared the skies above as Zeros chased them low, leaving the carriers exposed, and at that exact instant, McCluskey's dive bombers arrived overhead. The consequence was devastating. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had been hit, and a fleet that had once dominated the seas lay crippled before midday. The lesson was harsh and unmistakable. Aircraft carriers, unlike big-gun battleships, could be wiped out in moments if caught unready. Naval warfare had pivoted from armor and turret salvos to air wings and constant vigilance. For those aboard Akagi, this was not theory but a fight to survive a hellish blaze. Below decks, the young sailor who had smelled fuel hours before now ran through smoke-choked passageways, coughing, eyes burning, fingers clawing for any sign of escape. Around him, shipmates stumbled blindly. Some already lay overcome. The fire moved like a living thing, consuming metal and men with equal appetite. On the bridge, Captain Tairo Aayoki gripped the rail as the ship convulsed beneath his feet. He had poured years into Akagi and had watched her thunder at Pearl Harbor. To see her ruined in minutes was unbearable. Still, he barked commands, voice steady, refusing to yield hope, even as the flames raced on. High above, Lieutenant Richard Best pulled out from his dive, his heart hammering. He looked back at a towering pillar of flame rising from Akagi and felt no elation, only a heavy quiet that settled inside him. One release had extinguished scores of lives. The acrid smoke he had breathed would scar his lungs and end his flying career. Two men, enemies on opposite sides, a burning ship between them. By noon on June 4th, Akagi was no longer a fighting vessel, but a blazing hulk adrift in the Pacific and silent. Decks caved, hangars a furnace. Sailors kept fighting, but each explosion deepened despair. Wounded but unbroken, Aayoki finally faced the truth and ordered the crew to abandon ship. Hundreds plunged into the oily sea and clung to floating wreckage as the once proud flagship burned on. Nearly 267 men died that day, and many more would be lost in the waters that took them. Admiral Nagumo, seeing Akagi beyond saving, gave the grim command to scuttle her. Japanese destroyers circled and fired torpedoes into her hull. The carrier shuddered and began its slow descent. At 5:20 a.m. on June 5th, Akagi slipped beneath the waves. Swallowed by the ocean she had once ruled. Midway was more than a single clash. It was a watershed. In roughly 24 hours, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Kagikaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu, along with hundreds of aircraft and invaluable veteran pilots. The Imperial Navy, long seen as unstoppable, had been gutted at its core. The fall of Akagi hit hardest. She was the pride of the Kido Butai, the spearhead at Pearl Harbor, and a potent symbol of Japanese sea power. Her loss was material and psychological. For the first time, the public learned their navy could suffer catastrophic blows. Against the odds, the U.S. Navy had struck a decisive blow. Midway flipped the initiative. Japan would never again mount a major offensive across the Pacific. From that point, the Allies advanced island by island, pushing Japan back toward home. Strategically, the battle proved the carrier's supremacy over the battleship, one well-placed bomb could decide the fate of a Fleeton naval doctrine was remade, when Akagi's fires finally died beneath the surface. The stories of her men remained vivid and stark. Captain Tairo Aayoki survived, pulled from the water wounded, but survival brought little comfort. He carried the shame of losing the flagship for the rest of his life. The young sailor did not survive. Later recollections preserved only fragments of a charred helmet, drifting in the surf, a mute emblem of lives cut short. He stands for the countless unnamed men of war. No monuments, no headlines, only casualty lists. Each entry a family and a future erased. On the other side, Lieutenant Richard Best limped from the battle, a victor who was nonetheless scarred. Midway would be his last combat mission. He never flew in battle again. Yet in those few minutes, his strike altered the course of the war, dooming Akagi and hobbling Japan's reach. His name lived on, but the price was profoundly personal. 3 men, 3 destinies, and 1 burning ship tied them together by triumph. Shame and loss, but the sinking of a carrier meant more than the loss of steel in plains. It shattered Japan's dream of unchallenged naval dominance. In minutes, the ship that had spearheaded Pearl Harbor was reduced to wreckage and her crew scattered across the sea. Midway proved that even the mightiest fleet could fall in an instant. From that day, America fought not merely to survive, but to win. And the Empire of Japan, once triumphant, began a long retreat across the Pacific. History remembers Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War. And Akagi's fiery end remains a reminder how thin the line is between glory and ruin. What if Akagi had survived that morning? Could Japan have reversed its fortunes, or was the outcome already sealed? Perhaps you grew up with Midway stories from veterans or family. What do you recall from those accounts? If this account moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more untold battles and voices from World War